Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Here on the Debrief, we catch up with some of our favourite guests from the True Spies archive for a deeper look at the themes, events and insights that fascinate them. Robert Booth was a State Department counterintelligence officer and self-described spycatcher. We last heard from him in episode 5 of True Spies, when he told the tale of how he hunted down one of Cuba's most notorious double agents, Kendall Myers. In late 2023, a strangely similar story came to light, this time involving a former State Department official called Manuel Rocha. Rocha is believed to have aided Cuban intelligence gathering for over 40 years. He had extraordinary access to American secrets, having held posts in the White House under 2 US presidents and serving as the US ambassador to Bolivia. Yet he'd crossed Robert Booth's path back in 2010, when Robert put him on a list of potential intelligence threats. True Spies producer Morgan Childs sat down with Robert to hear the full story of how he came to know Rocha, and to hear what might happen next as this story unfolds.
Robert, thank you so much for being here. There are a lot of things that I want to ask you, but I'm particularly grateful to be with you in light of everything that's come out about Manuel Rocha. For listeners who don't know or don't remember, Rocha was convicted this April. He was found to have been spying on the U.S. on behalf of Cuba for about 40 years. During which time he held numerous high-profile positions, including the U.S. ambassador to Bolivia. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and I should say that he's 73 as of the time of recording, so 15 years is quite a long time.
In cases like that, it's normally considered a life sentence. It's how the Department of Justice really works those things.
Sure, yeah. Robert, I wanted to ask you, Jim Popkin reported in the Miami Herald that you included Rocha's name on a list of suspected threats over a dozen years ago, back in 2010. I wondered if you could talk about how he crossed your radar and what you knew about him at the time.
The intelligence community, following the identification of Kendall Myers as a Cuban spy, decided to share with me some coded communications that suggested that the Cuban intelligence services was managing a U.S. government employee with a security clearance who was working at specific U.S. embassies in Latin America during specific time frames. My job was to then comb through the State Department personnel records, telephone directories, lists of people at embassies at that time frame to see whether or not we could put names to those dates and times and places. Over several months, I was able to identify 4 or 5 State Department employees. And this is kind of the tricky part, because at an American embassy overseas, you have also members of the Department of Defense, you have Commerce, you have IRS, you actually have FBI agents working as legats. All I could do was look at State Department possibilities, because that's all the files that I had. And so when I came up with these 5 names in 2009, 2010, I said, okay, guys, here are my 5 choices. Manuel Rocha was one of the 5. Manuel Rocha, when I said he's a possibility, had already been retired from the State Department for 8 years. He was no longer an employee.
And then did it surprise you that so much time passed before hearing his name again?
Yes and no. And I think, and the best way to do that is look at this book called Circle of Treason. It's written by Sandy Grimes and Villafort. And Sandy Grimes remains a dear friend of mine after all these years. And she was part of the CIA team who in 1985 knew that there was a problem, that somehow agents working for the United States in Russia were actually being identified, arrested, and killed. So the CIA says, we have a problem. We have a mole. That's Jean Le Carrier's word. It's actually a penetration agent, is the word we use in the business. And they started looking. It took, after 8 years, the CIA team led by Sandy and Jean Vertfeuille, at the 8th year, the CIA said, we can't waste any more time. We're losing it. It was not until the 9th year, they actually extended, that they finally identified Aldrich Ames. So these cases do take time. And in the case of Rocha, he had retired. So he was not accessing classified information every day. He was not dealing with top secret information. So that I'm sure, in my opinion, I don't know this, I'm sure the FBI looked at the other 4 people first and spent a lot of time because they were going down the wrong track, because they were not spies. They were the ones I said met the profile. So finally, I think at one point someone said, hey, you know what? Let's look at this retired guy. And then things started to come out.
I'm glad that you mentioned Aldrich Ames. I think a lot of listeners will know his name. More will know Aldrich Ames's name than will know Rocha's name. I was listening to what Bob Baer had to say about Rocha on NPR, and he said, this is the worst penetration possibly since Ames and Robert Hansen, which is really strong language. I wonder if you agree with him.
I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. I know that Manuel Rocha had access to a tremendous amount of our diplomatic information. He was not on the list to see imagery. He would not have known who our counter spies, who our double agents were. That's not the kind of information he would have seen or would have had access to, even as an ambassador. He would not need to know the names of undercover CIA agents. That's not his job. But he would have allowed the Cuban government to have their pulse on the diplomatic initiatives that the U.S. government would have in vis-a-vis Cuba. Yes, in that particular case, he was an incredibly damaging spy. Now, Kendall Myers, on the other hand, who was an INR, the Office of Information Research, Intelligence and Research, he had more access to more classified information than Manuel Rocha did, to be honest.
Well, so the True Spies listeners know you most likely because of Kendall Myers. Tell me a little bit more about what the similarities are between these two men.
Well, the most striking thing about Kendall Myers and Manuel Rocha was the fact that they were recruited on an ideological basis. They were recruited during this late 60s, early 70s, when America was just going through all this radical discontent in the United States, the Vietnam War, ERA, black civil rights, and so on and so forth. They were radicalized. And so both actually had contact with Cuban intelligence agents before they joined the State Department. So those two commonalities to me are stunning. Again, after that, both are highly educated. Both went to Ivies. Kendall went to Brown. Manuel Rocha went to Yale. Kendall Myers then went on to get his PhD at Johns Hopkins University. Manuel Rocha, through the State Department, went back to school both at Harvard and Georgetown. They both had multiple marriages, and they continued to spy unsuspected. They survived update investigations every 5 years. They went about their business. And I know in talking, when I debrief Kendall Myers, and I understand through the talks with Manuel Rocha, both of them trained themselves to listen carefully and read carefully secrets. And they didn't come out of their building or embassy with the documents in their pockets, or they'd bring cameras in to photograph them. They came out of those buildings with all the thoughts in their minds. They had great memories, and they got back to their apartment, and then they wrote out the meat of what they heard or what they read, and then transmitted that information on to the Cuban intelligence service.
It's very interesting. I've heard the same thing about Ana Montes, that she also had an airtight memory.
And the reason that is if you look at the old spies in the past, when the FBI would raid the home with a search warrant, they would go in and they'd find mini micro cameras, they'd find the little Lennox cameras, they smell the fall film, they'd find the dolls where you'd hide the film in to send back to an accommodation address, wherever it would be. All that is absolute evidence of spying. You'd have the red bulb, so you'd develop your own film. All that stuff is now gone. All you have to do is come home, write down on your laptop what you remembered from the office, encrypt it, and then send it out. Almost impossible to find these days. So your laptop, which is your great tool, is a tool that would go unnoticed.
You say that these guys taught themselves. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, as Kendall Myers explained to me, memory is a tough thing to do. And a lot of times, if you don't focus on the information that's of interest to you, you kind of forget it. My wife reminds me of this every day. I forget what I told her I was going to do last night. So you have to train yourself and educate yourself. And a little trick that you will do is you'll have a little piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, you'll write down specific words that help you remember what you learned in the office. They're key words you use. And it allows you, when you get back to your home, that key word will allow you to recreate that whole conversation or that whole document.
But I don't want to give the impression that the Cuban intelligence agencies are not
training them to do this?
Yes.
No, not at all. Kendall said when you learn the spycraft, you always want to make sure you leave no fingerprints out there. And the fingerprints would be obviously bringing the document home or try to photocopy the document. So what you have to do is minimize your counter-espionage indicators. And the big one there is just learn to remember. Learn keywords, learn to recreate. And also, during the day, you're not going to see all the kinds of documents, hundreds of documents a day concerning Cuba. You might see one or two, so you're not being forced every day to memorize reams of information.
I guess my point in bringing that up is that one sort of major revelation to come out of this is not a revelation at all to somebody like you, but I think in the mainstream press and to the sort of layperson, Rocha has really brought to the surface just how skillful the Cuban intelligence really is, which is something that somebody like you has known forever. But I wonder if you could speak about Cuba's skills and how they stand out, perhaps, compared to other agencies around the world.
Well, the most important consideration is the fact that the Cuban intelligence services can focus all their energy on the prime enemy, and that's the United States. If you look at the Russian intelligence service or the Chinese intelligence services, they focus on everything. The Russians have to worry about the Brits. They have to worry about the French. They have to worry about their Chinese. The Chinese have the same things, the same issues, the same threats. The Cubans, they do not. The Cubans are friends with the Chinese. The Cubans are friends with the Chinese and the Russians. So that their main focus is strictly on identifying those sources of information they want from the United States. And really, until 1995, there were no arrests of spies working for the Cubans or spies in the United States. The FBI identified what I think was called the WASP ring. And these were 5 Cubans who had gained access to the Cuban community in Miami and in Florida. And they were reporting back to the Cuban government about politics. Who were the pro-Castro, the anti-Castro people in Miami, in the Florida area? So they were not focused on stealing the secrets of the next generation of American nuclear submarines. That was not important to the Cubans. The Cubans' great interest is what is the pulse of American politics and who in the Cuban community down in, especially Florida, would be pro or con. And what is surprising, of course, is when these 5 Cuban agents were arrested, please remember that at that same time, there were 4 Cuban spies working inside the U.S. government. There was Kendall Myers, there was Manuel Rocha, there was Ana Montes. Hidden under all that, the Cubans had penetrated us deeply, and we did not know about it.
It's alarming. We know from at least one report from the National Intelligence Council that Cuba has attempted to meddle in the last American midterm elections. And I wonder if interference is on your mind now, looking ahead at this November.
I do. I think the Cubans have a vested interest in ensuring that politically those who are elected are favorably disposed to the Cuban government, or that people who get into the ring of influence around American politicos might have a more sympathetic view towards the Cuban government. It all depends on what the Cubans would identify as important to them to get their assets close to and around politicians and others, people of influence, that their voice can be heard. Absolutely.
I suppose in some cases that means sending information out to other U.S. adversaries. Would that be
absolutely. There's no question in my mind that Cubans share their information with the Iranian government, the Russian government, the Chinese government. Anything that could help them in their good standing with those countries, the Cubans would share. I don't know how much Manuel Rocha would have done that, saying, I'm going to get this information to the Cubans so the Cubans can share it with the Russians or the Chinese. I'm not aware of that. Deep in his mind, he would have to know that the Cubans had a good relationship with those governments and share. And not only that, would be Venezuela and Nicaragua at the same time also, which Manuel Rocha then would have had more information about, him being a Latin American expert.
And Rocha reportedly spent about half the time that he worked for Cuba in the U.S. government and the other half spying from within the private sector.
Right. From the day Manuel Rocha joined the government, for those 22 years that he worked for the U.S. government, he was spying for the Cubans full-time, reporting full-time. When he left, he did work, I think, for one American component for a year. But given the fact that he's a retired U.S. ambassador, he would have had access to American businesses trying to do business in Cuba. He'd have access to politicians, people who pronounce themselves on U.S.-Cuba relations, or even Venezuela or Nicaragua. Yes, former U.S. ambassadors are sought out by the business community, by others, intellectuals and academics, to give them their opinions about his experiences dealing with Cuba and other Latin American countries.
I'd like to take a step back a little bit. Sure. Because obviously the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba it looks quite different than when you were working for the State Department and really not so long ago. I have to wonder what it looks like for you as a former counterintelligence officer to see that relationship sour.
Well, given the unevenness in the last 8 years, it's been pretty bad, to be honest with you.
But what has been your experience of watching these 8 years sort of transpire?
It only confirms for me that the Cuban intelligence services will continue to target U.S. citizens with access to classified information. It's in their complete interest to know our diplomatic and military intentions, and they will do everything they can. I mean, they have a mission to the UN in New York City, which is an extra bonus for the Cuban intelligence service, and their diplomats and their intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover here in the United States. They're allowed to see and do things that our diplomats could never do in Cuba. They can go, a Cuban diplomat or a Cuban asset could end up at George Washington University taking a night course. And who would be taking night courses at George Washington University International Relations? Well, that would be State Department officers, and that would be DOD officers. And so they have access to American citizens, those with classified information, those who not, that we simply cannot do in Cuba. And so our open society, and I know that's a trite phrase, but that allows them to take advantage of our openness and allows them to take advantage of the fact that we believe in sharing information. Certainly our students do. So in those milieus, those after-hours symposia or colloquia, I guarantee you there are Cuban assets trying to find out who in those classes and meetings are showing sympathetic views or sympathetic thoughts towards the Cuban people. Maybe not necessarily the Cuban government, but if that individual could pass himself off as a democratic Cuban looking for friends, I'm sure there are a few Americans who'd fall under that spell. They have to continue to do this in order to survive. The Cuban government, as it's composed today, cannot survive without having full knowledge of what America's up to and what our politicians are up to. Those are the kind of things the Cubans have to do to survive. They must.
When we spoke before this interview, we used the term underestimated. I wonder if you feel that Cuba's threat is underestimated compared to those of the nation's larger adversaries and major nuclear powers.
I think it was up to Manuel Rocha. I think at that particular point, we realized just how penetrated we had become. For them to have successfully recruited well, I will be honest with you on this one. There are more. I know for a fact there are more. And I know for a fact some have gotten away. Having also worked with the intelligence community on additional coded information, I know there are several who got away. And that means the Cubans are even more successful than is publicly known.
So I want to ask you, as a person who's now long retired, what is it like to walk around in a country that you feel has been compromised so severely so many times over?
Well, again, I realize that the United States is the main target for a number of intelligence services. And I think that it will continue, and I think for a number of reasons, mostly for people who want money, they are going to be recruited. Hansen, Ames, Pitts, and others I can name. I mean, I was an expert witness in the Brian Regan case. He was an NSA employee who was trying to sell information to foreign intelligence services back in 2003, 2004. So, yeah, I mean, I worry about the fact that intelligence services continue to operate in the United States and to continue to have success.
A number of these high-profile cases have ended in plea deals where the spies in question have agreed to cooperate with the U.S. in damage assessments, and that's also true in Rocha's case. What do you think? Are we going to learn much about what he was up to over the past 4 decades?
What we will probably learn is the name of 1 or 2 of his handlers. We'll probably learn some of his spycraft. We will probably go back and realize all the information that he had as U.S. ambassador, he had as the deputy ambassador in Havana for 3 years. All that information is compromised. So the damage assessment is a lot. But again, we're not going to learn much more than the fact that we have to now realize that a lot of our diplomatic messages were compromised. And the people who worked with him, his assessments of these men and women are all compromised. He would be able to tell the Cubans who in the State Department or international relations were somewhat sympathetic, very sympathetic, unsympathetic to the Cuban government. He would have also been able to share with the Cubans who he thought were intelligence officers under diplomatic cover. He will tell it. We would have to suspect that. So the damage assessment will be what he will confirm. Would he confirm that he had access to a technical operation that, let's say, the NSA or the CIA were running, that he compromised that? That's what we will learn in the damage assessment. I mean, we have to just assume everything else is frankly compromised, which is bad enough.
And it could be years, right, before we get much information
again,
publicly available.
Before it's public? It will never become public. What people can do is you can look at the public record, say, well, when was he residing at the U.S. interest section in Cuba, or when was he, the deputy chief of mission in a country in Latin America? Go back that time frame, look what the politics were of that time, see who was there, and you can publicly make your own guesstimates about what was potentially compromised and what kind of information he gave to the Cubans. But the names of intelligence officers under diplomatic cover in every single country he was in, we now have to assume they were all compromised. Now, I will say this. There's no information at this point that any person he compromised died. He would probably never have been given the name of a Cuban double agent. He probably would never have been given name or access to really sensitive imagery operations or technical operations because it's simply not in his bailiwick. But he could have given enough to be damaging.
Great. Okay. All right. Well,
I know it's bad
that's an
enough.
alarming note to end on. So I'd like to ask you about something a little bit more pleasant, which is I hear that you have a book in the works.
I do have a second manuscript. It is now in pre-publication review. It involves 3 University of Wisconsin students who were recruited by the East German Intelligence Service to spy. Once again, they were recruited on a strictly ideological basis. University of Wisconsin, Madison was a radical campus back in the 60s and 70s. And they semi-self-recruited to the Stasi, and they were able, one of them, a gentleman by the name of Jim Clark, who I debriefed after his arrest, was able to tell me how he seduced 2 State Department employees, seduced not in the intimate terms, seduced intellectually, to provide him with classified information. And so that book, it's a 1997, all 3 served 13 to 15 years, and they're all out, and they're all leading very quiet lives. They will probably be very unhappy to see that they're going to be public once again. All this information about these 3 is very public. It was in the news, it was in the press, it was everything else. Hopefully in the next 5 to 6 months, it will be out and available for purchase.
Wow. All right. And what does the research process look like for something like that?
Well, I was involved in the case because of the 2 State Department employees. So I was helping the FBI better understand how Jim Clark was getting his information, so that I worked with the FBI while the case was ongoing. So I saw a lot about how the FBI conducted the case, how these 3 individuals developed information, how they sent the information back to the East German Intelligence Service. I actually was pretty much involved in the process and the physical handling of these 3 spies. Very intimate at that particular point.
Well, I'm looking forward to the book. I hope you'll let us know when it's ready to go.
But, one thing I forgot to mention, when I talk about what the Cubans were doing in Florida, attempting to get a pulse on how the Cuban American community was acting in Cuba, just 3 weeks ago, a gentleman by the name of, I gotta get my glasses here, Shuzheng Wang, a 75-year-old naturalized Chinese U.S. citizen, was arrested in New York, tried and convicted for being a member and asset of the Ministry for State Security. This guy was an academic, and while he was in New York City, he got into the Chinese community there. He discovered who were the pro-Tiananmen people. He found out who were the hardliners, who were the pro, and he was reporting back to Beijing on the Chinese community in the United States, subverting them, gaining their trust, and betraying them to the Chinese intelligence service. This is exactly what Rocha was doing in the last part of his life while he was working in Miami or in Florida, identifying those people who the Cubans wanted to know much about. So again, the Chinese do it, the Cubans do it.
You have a smile on your face, and I want to ask you, is there a part of you that kind of enjoys the thriller aspect of all of this, or?
I enjoy the opportunity to talk about this passion. It's a discipline that I have. I joined the government because my father was in the government. My father was a military police officer with the 3rd Armored Division during World War II. And I have relatives who were police officers. My nephew, Brian, is currently a police officer in Binghamton, New York. And I did not come to counterintelligence. Law enforcement is the discipline by where you solve crimes. And counterintelligence and counterespionage is a very small discipline in the law enforcement scope of investigations. And I was actually, to be honest with you, I was someone who made fun of counterintelligence people. I actually wrote a little article in our organization magazine called Caught Any Spies Lately, where I used to make fun of my counterintelligence people saying, have you caught any spies lately? And then in the latter part of my career, in the last third of my career, Against my wishes, I was assigned to the Office of Counterintelligence. It was not what I wanted to do. I did not believe in it. And within a year, I became an acolyte. And then, by pure chance, the intelligence community embraced me. I became a very accepted member of this community, and I think I've been able to give to it. And that's why I'm smiling, because I'd like the public to appreciate what the women and men in counterintelligence do. They do work. They don't get a lot of publicity. And in the case of Sandy Grimes and Villefort, they work in quite closed rooms. But I enjoy talking about it because I think it's a fascinating discipline, because we're talking about betrayal. It's one of those emotions that is hard to come by. I mean, when people ask me, how do you define betrayal? The only way I can do it is think of a married couple and one spouse learns he or she's been betrayed. It's devastating. That person you've been sharing your life with, you've been sharing your intimacies with, your secrets with, has betrayed you. That's the only way I can say how some of the people with Rocha and Kendall Myers and others felt when all of a sudden it was revealed that they, in fact, a close, dear friend, in fact, had betrayed them. And that's hard. That's very hard. And in fact, as I understand it, everyone that the teams, the investigators have talked to in Rocha's case, not a single one suspected him ever. And same with Kendall Myers. Never suspected. So I smile because I enjoy talking about it. I think I know what I'm talking about. So it's simple, and again, it's a subject matter that I think, Morgan, is very interesting. You don't find I hate to say this, you find murderers every day. If you find one or two spies a year, I mean real spies, that's a big deal.
Well, it sounds like you ended up in the right career despite not setting out
I lucked
for
out,
what you got.
Morgan. I lucked out. It was pure luck.
Well, listen, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Morgan, my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in for the debrief. We're so happy to have you along for the ride. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between our producer, Morgan Childs, and Robert Booth. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Some people would call me a spy hunter, and that would be relatively accurate.
Not only was Robert responsible for finally revealing the identity of Cuba's US mole, he was also part of the team that hunted Myers down and eventually caught him in the act.
I learned very early on in my career there were things you needed to do in order to ensure your safety, and look around you to see whether or not the individuals you might be working with are in fact potential spies. Information will always be sought clandestinely by almost every country in the world. People who believe as though the U.S. government is not a good player and that the United States has attempted to betray other countries so that some Americans believe in helping level the playing field by allowing these countries to have our secrets.
True Spies, the classics, from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.